So as I was saying before I pushed the record button, we're not going to get into existentialism is a humanism quite yet. We'll see how long it takes me to kind of provide an introduction to Sartre. But I don't want to spend too much time on this. Uh, uh, I want to save most of existentialism is a humanism for next class, Tuesday's meeting at 11. Um, we might maybe read the first few opening lines if we have time, but we'll see. But the main point I'd like to get at is talking a bit about Sartre's philosophy before existentialism is a humanism. So the reading that we're doing is actually a lecture that he gave in 1945. And he gave this lecture a few years after he had already published a larger work, this great, huge philosophical tome, um, Being and Nothingness. I'll write that out here. So Being and Nothingness is perhaps Sartre's most important work. It's probably his most famous, most important work. And when it was published, it it made him pretty much overnight like an intellectual star, and he was being debated amongst philosophical intellectual circles in Europe, particularly France and and Germany. But by the time Sartre is giving this lecture, he has kind of been branded the sort of leader of the existentialist movement. So his philosophy is known as existentialism. Now this is a label that he did not give to himself, and in fact, in the lecture, which we'll dive into next week, he mentions a few people who he claims are fellow existentialists. He distinguishes between Christian existentialists and atheistic existentialists, and he claims that they all sort of share this sort of one belief that existence precedes essence. Maybe we'll get to that today. I doubt it, but all the people he lists would not they would not like to be referred to as existentialists. Sartre was the only one of the group who sort of just accepted the label, even though he did not coin it himself. When he was writing this book, Being and Nothingness, this is before the whole existentialist classification had been pinned on him. He really saw himself as doing phenomenology. So let's talk about that briefly. Can't get into all the details. But yeah, so Sartre saw himself as a phenomenologist. He was doing phenomenology. And in this book, Being and Nothingness, since he is looking at and analyzing being, what does it mean to be? His phenomenology focuses on being, so it's also an ontology. So let's clarify these terms a little bit more. What is phenomenology? What is ontology? Well, let's do ontology first because that one's a little bit more straightforward. You can give a pretty simple definition. Ontology is merely the study of being. You might add the word philosophical to the front of that definition. The philosophical examination of being. What does it mean to be? Going back to the Greek term, the Greek word ontos, to be. Phenomenology is something that takes a little bit more explaining. What do phenomenologists do? Well, I could give you a sort of a parallel type definition of phenomenology. It's the study of phenomena, but that's not very helpful, I suppose. We definitely need to expand on that, even if you know what the word phenomena means. Most people I find, or most of my students, don't know the meaning of the word phenomena, or they associate it with the word phenomenal. They get it confused with the word phenomenal. There's a relationship between the two, but usually when you say that something's phenomenal, it's like, oh, that was great, that was phenomenal, that was exciting or amazing or something like this. But the term phenomena is the plural. It's the plural of phenomenon. And the word phenomenon is perhaps one of the most general and abstract terms. I can't even spell it. Phenomenon. No, that's right. Okay. Yeah, it's one of the most general and abstract terms in the English language. It's almost like the word thing or stuff. You know, a phenomenon is simply an event, something that happens, something that occurs. And so to say that phenomenology is a study of phenomena is not that helpful, because you could say, well, what science or what discipline isn't the study of phenomenon? I mean, maybe they focus on one particular type of phenomenon, like biology studies the phenomenon of life, or all the different types of life. So the phenomena, maybe we should pluralize that. Um, chemistry studies chemicals, that chemical phenomena. But the way that phenomenologists do this, the way they study phenomena, is going to be different than the natural sciences and different than other kind of disciplines. I feel like the font here is super small. Let me make that a bit bigger. Hopefully y'all can see it better there. I don't know if I picked the best design for Sartre. It just was kind of gloomy looking, so he's always he's always sort of criticized for being Mr. Gloomy, sort of the goth philosopher, the existentialist. Um, but anyways, back to phenomenology. Phenomenology studies phenomena in a distinct way with a different method than you would in science. Um, Let me put a couple names up here next to phenomenology. Husserl was a German philosopher. He lived in Germany, right? And Heidegger, also German. They were both very important figures in the development of phenomenology, especially Husserl. Really, he's considered the father of phenomenology. Heidegger, moved on to sort of do his own thing, but he was a bit of a phenomenologist himself early in his career. And both of these men had a big influence on Sartre. He studied in Germany, and that's where he learned about phenomenology. And the way that Husserl describes it, and what makes it different from like a natural science, is that natural science, if you're doing biology or chemistry or physics, um, Husserl would say that you are studying it from a third person perspective. So in other words, you're describing a scientific phenomenon, let's say like, I don't know, a chemical reaction or something like this, through observation. You're observing chemicals under controlled, um, um, I'm like a loss for a word. You have controlled experiments in a controlled lab or whatever the heck. You're observing stuff. You're seeing things that other people can see, and you guys can both compare each other's notes, and it's something that is available to both of you, right? You're both able to see, as scientists, what's going on in the experiment, how these chemicals react to each other. You can make observations. That's the third person perspective. Now, Husserl said that the phenomenologist tries to understand the phenomenon from the first person. So, in other words, what is it like to experience that phenomenon from the inside? So, if I'm looking at a chemical reaction, what is the experience of what is it like to experience a chemical reaction? Not what are the objective qualities of it that we can measure under a microscope or through observation, these sort of things, but rather, what does it mean when I say I'm experiencing a chemical reaction? What is the phenomenology of that? To give an example, and I'm going to use a very simple example, one that I don't think Husserl would approve of, but I'm keeping it simple just to demonstrate more or less his methodology and what makes him different from what makes his phenomenology different from, being a scientist or something. Let's just take a house, for example. We all know what a house is. And Husserl would never waste his time on houses, but if he did, and he was trying to perform a phenomenology on houses, the way that he would typically begin, when he would describe it, again, from the first person perspective. When you see a house, what do you see, right? When you stand in front of a house, what is the experience like to you? Well, obviously, you experience it as a solid structure. If it wasn't, if it didn't seem like it was solid, like if it was shaped like a house and it kind of looked like a house, but it was obvious that it was made out of Jello, like a big wobbly kind of house, like that's not really a house. That's a Jello house or a big old, whatever, a piece of art. Maybe like some artist is being clever. It's some art installation or something like this. But an actual real house, we're talking solidity. So it's being solid, it has walls, it has a back and a front, has a roof, has a driveway, has a fence. So I'll start with sort of my experience of the object in question, whether it's a house or anything else. Once I've just described it in my pure first person experience, how it appears to me, and how and the features of it that are striking to me, then I take that phenomenological description, as Husserl would call it. I take that description and I start to remove certain elements from that description, and I ask myself, is it still a house? So, for instance, let's say it didn't have a driveway. Would it still be a house? I would say yes. I would prefer, if it was my house, I would prefer it had a driveway. But I suppose if it didn't, you would still classify it as a house. I would still experience it as a house. My experience of it as a house would not change. So you keep performing this operation and removing certain elements. Well, what if there were no windows? What if there was just a door and no windows? Well, again, I would prefer a house with windows so I could look outside, but I suppose you don't necessarily have to have windows, so that's not essential. But eventually, Husserl thought you would get down to the features of this experience that were essential. What is essential to a house? What if I get rid of the door and you can't even get inside the darn thing? It's just a big box that's hollow inside with no entryway, no way to walk in, no openings, nothing. Is it still a house? I would say no. At that point, it's just a cube, a piece of modern art or sculpture or something like that. We could debate this, but this is what phenomenologists do. They try to get at the essence of that experience. What is essential to a house? Again, Husserl would probably be embarrassed to hear me give the example. He did not waste his time with such petty phenomena, such mundane phenomena as a house. And he focused, for him, it was consciousness. Consciousness, this is the phenomenon par excellence. Everything we experience is always experienced in our consciousness. We're always aware, we're always thinking, our thoughts are what we can't deny. In a way, he's almost like Descartes here. Remember, for Descartes, I think, therefore I am. I can't deny my thoughts, and my thoughts are the basis for all the other things I experience. So Husserl is, I think there's parallels, you could say, between Husserl and Descartes here. And so Husserl says, well, I can't deny my experience. I'm having my experience. Let's get to the essence of things. What's the essence of houses? Of course, again, houses, forget that. What's the essence of consciousness? What does it mean to be conscious? Now, when we get to figures like Heidegger, and this is where Sartre comes in, they thought of being as more essential. It was a more essential and a more important phenomena, excuse me, um, being was a more important and essential phenomenon than consciousness. That consciousness is something, what Husserl thought of as consciousness, having an ego, having a self, being a thinking thing, to use Descartes' term. This was something that was a result of being engaged with the world around us. So being comes first, and therefore, consciousness is something that evolves from our engagement with being. So Heidegger argues being is the most important phenomenon. I don't think Husserl quite understood him and thought he was going all metaphysical, and didn't like this, right? Because the phenomenologists, they don't like to ask questions like Descartes. What if there's an evil genius, and how do I know I'm? They kind of avoid the skeptical problems. They kind of bracket away, as Husserl would say. They set aside all those metaphysical questions about what is the thing in itself, what is the underlying thing, what is that. That's a question for something else. We're talking about my first person experience and what are the essential aspects of it. So when he hears Heidegger talking about being and Sartre talking about being, he thinks of this as some sort of mystical being. But for Heidegger, being is something that is a part of our very, very existence. Um, I guess what is it? Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am." You could maybe characterize Heidegger as kind of inverting that. It's not "I think, therefore I am." I am. I have being. I'm thrown into a world that is full of things that are, and therefore I have thoughts, and I react to my environment, and I carve out a space that I call myself, and that's a reaction to my adaptations to what is. So being is primary, not thought, but being. Thought is latches on to what is. And so this is sort of Heidegger's approach, and Sartre is very much he's very much impressed by it. And so he takes a lot of influence from Husserl, but you can say, is along the lines with Heidegger as far as focusing on being. So Being and Nothingness, the title of his book, his famous book, would seem to align him with Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger wrote a book. Heidegger's most famous work is Being and Nothing, or Being and Time. Sorry, Sein und Zeit. Yeah, and that was published in 1927. Sartre publishes Being and Nothingness in 1943. And so, the title of Sartre's work, Being and Nothingness, if you know philosophy, it would make you think of Heidegger. Oh, he's influenced by Heidegger. And he certainly is, but he strikes his own path. So when Sartre gets to his study of being, when Sartre starts to analyze what it means to be phenomenologically, he essentially arrives at a dualistic ontology. Dualistic in the sense that there are two types of being. For Sartre, there is being for itself and being in itself. So these are the two types of being which we encounter in existence, according to Sartre. And I'll explain the distinction between the two in just a moment. But in general, for Sartre, whenever we say that something is, whether I'm saying that this bottle of water is, or this desk is, or I am, or my students are, what I normally, in order to make this sort of judgment, I hate to use the word judgment, probably better to have this understanding of the world, to make this interpretation of the world for Sartre. What I do when I see that something is, I do this by distinguishing it from other things. So all things have their being by being different, by being not everything else. So this bottle is not my hand. It's not the air around it. It's not, I put it back on my desk. It's not the desk. It's not all the other things. It is just itself, right? It is what it is, as Sartre would say about the in itself. And so all beings are known in isolation from other beings. And that's sort of the general idea of being. But when I try to do this and I try to isolate myself, or actually, hold on, I'm jumping way ahead. When I do this, right, forget about myself. We'll get to myself later. That's going to come up in just a minute. But when I'm just looking at objects, for instance, like this bottle of water, right, and I know that it's not all that surrounds it. It's its own entity separate from everything else. When I do that and I say, "There's my bottle of water," or "I'm sitting in my chair," or something like that, when I notice these things around me and I reach out for them and use them, Sartre is very emphatic, and I think he gets this from Heidegger more than Husserl. That when I do this, when I point over there to the desk and say, "Hey, see that desk over there? I'm not just involved in some rational calculation. I'm not just some sort of computer walking around like the Terminator robot. If you've ever seen those Terminator movies where that shows you the Terminator's point of view, and the robot just walks into the room and he kind of analyzes everything. There's a person. Is he a threat? Yes, no. How tall is he? What's his approximate weight and height? you know maybe the mind is doing that at a sort of unconscious level, but as on the level of my experience, that's not how things go. I look at an object and it sort of stands out to me. Some objects might stand out more than others, and so when I notice an object as a chair or as a bottle of water, it's not necessarily just a logical calculation putting things into sort of a value system that's already prescribed. It's for Sartre, he's going to argue, I'm putting an interpretation on the thing. There's normative content to that judgment. To call this a bottle of water, to call this a smartphone, I could, from this point on, I could call this a zebra if I wanted to. For Sartre, we're going to get more into the details of this later, but for Sartre, he is very adamant that as an individual experiencing the world, I have a radical freedom, and I have a freedom to interpret things however I decide. And so if I wanted to start calling these zebras, and I don't care what you call them, but I call them zebras, I can do that, but I don't. I mean, I could, but most people don't do that. Most people follow convention. Most people, why not? Why don't they call this a zebra? Because that wouldn't be very useful. That wouldn't really help them, right? So for Sartre, um, we follow these norms, we follow these standards, but we're the ones that decide to engage in these. We're sort of playing, to use another philosopher, Wittgenstein, we're playing a sort of language game. We've decided to go ahead and conform to the standards of whatever language we learn growing up. So um, Sartre is going to be pretty absolute when it comes to this idea of freedom, the freedom that I have. He's going to say that the only limits of my freedom, let's put a sort of list here, limits. Let me get a new slide going here. So limits for Sartre, not many. Uh, what he calls facticity, that's a word he gets from Heidegger. And other freedoms. That's it. Okay. So what is facticity? I am not free to change the things about me, like my age or when I was born, who my parents were, what city I'm from, the fact that I need air to breathe, the fact that I can't levitate or fly. That's just the facts. Can't change that. But other than that, I'm completely free. Only other thing that can limit me are other freedoms. And that's kind of obvious, but there's another way that isn't so obvious. So obviously, people can physically restrain you. They can put you in jail. They can do all sorts of violence towards you. But there's even more subtle ways in which other people affect your freedom, which we're going to also get to by the end of the lecture. Um, so anyway, so there's this radical freedom that we have. Because we have this radical freedom, Sartre says, we engage in projects. Okay, so we decide we engage in a project. We decide we want to become a student, and we go to school, and we have goals that we set for ourselves. But for him, those projects aren't set in stone. They're completely up to us. It's our absolute freedom to decide what sort of projects we want to engage in. So this brings us back to the question of, well, what are we and who are we and what is the self? Um, I mentioned that Sartre's ontology, his theory of being, his ontology is dualistic. So there are two types of beings. There are the type of beings that we are, and that's the first one I have up here, the being for itself, le toi en soi, pour soi, the being for itself is the free individual, right? The consciousness that is constantly, uh, Sartre is a very funny way of putting this, a kind of confusing way of putting it. It is what it is not. It's a lack of being. When you try to separate yourself from your environment, for like you would the objects around you. Remember, I said earlier that, for Sartre, this object has being by being distinguished from everything else. It's not the air, it's not the table, it's not. If I perform that operation on myself, I end up with nothing left, says Sartre. I am this nothingness at the heart of existence. I'm not the desk. I'm not the bottle of water. I'm not you. I'm not the computer screen. And I'm not my body either. I have a body. I inhabit the body. I have the experience of inhabiting a body. But the for itself is this emptiness. It's this nothingness. It's not until the for itself engages in a project and becomes, I want to become a doctor, I want to become a student, that they start to have a sense of identity. So the for itself has this radical freedom. The in itself, that's the other category of being, the being in itself, the en soi. These are just the things of my experience. These are the things that are for me. The desk, the table, other people as objects, right? If you want to use sort of more colloquial terms, the for itself is the subject, the in itself are the objects. So you can think of the for itself as consciousness, or the conscious being, the thinking thing, the cogito in Descartes' language. And the in itself, that is the objects, the ideas, the material objects we experience out there. These are all a part of the in itself. They're the things, they're the objects for me. And for him, for Sartre, the objects have no meaning outside of the context of my project. So, this bottle of water has value and meaning and significance for me in the context of the project of giving a lecture and having a dry mouth and needing to take a sip of water. Different objects can have different meanings for different people depending on the context in which that object is embedded, and depending on the project that the person is involved in who is encountering that object. There's a movie I saw when I was a kid. It's probably really politically incorrect. It was like, I think it was a South African movie or an Australian movie, but it kind of makes this point pretty well. I don't know if it's aged well because I haven't seen it since like the late 80s, early 90s. But the movie is called The Gods Must Be Crazy. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy. Well, the very, very opening scene, there's this guy flying an airplane over, I forget what part of Africa, but it's in the thick of the jungle, the Congo or something, with all, there's, it's not in like I'm trying to think of like a big major city in Kenya though, like, but my geography is failing me all of a sudden. It's not like Cape Town or something like that. It's in the thick of the heart of the jungle, close to the equator. He's flying over the jungle and he drops. I think he litters. He like throws his bottle of Coke out the wall, out of the window. So this Coca-Cola bottle is like falling down and it hits the trees and kind of like that. The trees break its fall, and eventually the Coke bottle gets to the ground without breaking. And some tribesman picks up the bottle and doesn't know what it is. He's never seen it. He's never been to the industrialized world, so he's never seen a glass bottle like that before. And he, at first, I think the first guy thinks it's an instrument. He blows into it, it makes a noise, and he starts playing it, and people start getting excited. And then someone says, no, that's good for cooking and making bread. And the whole movie, it starts a war. They use it as a tool, and in different contexts, it takes on a different meaning. So for Sartre, the objects have no meaning in themselves. The meaning is always given to them by the place that they hold in the context of this project. So I might change my project too. Because Sartre says I have this radical freedom. I can change my project at any time. And when I change my project, the meaning of the in itself, the meaning of the objects might change. Not necessarily, but they might. You know, if I decide next week I want to be a chemistry professor, let's say, instead of a philosophy professor, well, now I got to go back to school, and now I might start paying more attention to ads on my computer screen when it's talking about going back to college or student loans, things that I normally would have scrolled past or ignored. I like to go to bookstores, and I usually go straight to the philosophy department. Now that I'm interested in chemistry, you know, maybe out of habit, I'll just go straight to philosophy. But on the way to the philosophy department, I see a stack of books that's been there for months, and I never noticed it before. But all of a sudden, it jumps out at me because it's a stack of chemistry books. So the objects haven't changed, but my interpretation of them has changed. And my possible way to interpret them is infinite. You know, the mountain range doesn't have any meaning or value in itself. The mountain range only gets its value, according to Sartre, through its engagement, or sorry, its place in my project, how I engage with it. If I'm on vacation in Switzerland and I'm just sort of hiking through the mountains and I come across this beautiful mountainscape, I come to the Swiss Alps and I'm just there enjoying the view. It is something to be visually appreciated, to be aesthetically appreciated, to be photographed, to be posted on my Instagram profile. But if I was a mountain climber, I would still maybe see the beauty, but I would also be thinking about how I would climb it, how much equipment I need to bring, if it's even worth climbing. Maybe it's not challenging enough. Maybe it's too challenging. I got to try something easier first. You know, depending on the project that I'm engaged in, that same exact scene is going to take on a whole new meaning. Again, the only limits to this, the only limits that I have to my own freedom are my facticity. I can't change certain things about just I guess, my biology and just my physical needs, the time period that I find myself immersed in. I didn't choose to be born, just here I am. But once I'm here, I can interpret the world however I see fit. Sartre once said that a man being executed on the way to the guillotine is just as free as you and I are here, sitting in class, just chilling out, listening to a lecture or whatever you're doing right now. Which seems kind of like absurd. How could he say that the person who's a prisoner, all handcuffed, about to be executed, how are they just as free as us? Well, they aren't able to do much with their freedom, but they're able to interpret the situation. Sartre would be insistent on this. They're able to interpret the situation how they see fit. The criminal going to be executed could be walking to the guillotine with his head held high, proud of what he's done. I did the right thing. This is injustice. I was fighting for the revolution. Even though I failed, I was, fighting for the right cause, with his head held high. Or he could be hanging his head in shame. Oh, I'm a horrible criminal. Or he could be pleading for his life. Please don't kill me. I swear I'm innocent. There's all these different ways in which the criminal, or maybe he's innocent. Who knows? The man who's the prisoner on the way to the guillotine can react to the situation. So Sartre is a pretty hard liner about this. That our freedom is absolute. The only limits, again, are our facticity and other freedoms. So obviously, other people can get in the way of my freedom. But the problem is, though, most of us want to exaggerate this, Sartre says. Let me bring up, for Sartre, one of his more well-known concepts is this idea of bad faith. He seems to think that most of us are guilty of bad faith most of the time. And what that means is that we're not really being honest about the nature of our freedom. We tend to play like a role. He uses the example of a waiter at a restaurant. And I don't know, waiting isn't quite what it used to be unless you go to like the real bougie places, but maybe his example is kind of outdated. But if you ever been to like a real bougie restaurant, like a fine dining French cuisine, think of how how prim and proper the waiter might have been. Sartre describes this waiter. He's standing too straight. He's almost too nice, too eager. Madame, Monsieur. What can we do for you? And almost just obsequious, and he's playing the role of the good waiter. Um, Sartre seems to think that there's this tendency in us, and I think that it's true. Maybe it's stronger in some people than others, but we don't like to take responsibility for our own lives. We like to make excuses for this. Um, Sartre once wrote that we want to be an inkwell the way that an inkwell is an inkwell. But nobody knows what an inkwell is anymore, so I don't know if that's the best metaphor. Uh, well, maybe does somebody know what an inkwell is? Anybody know what one is? There's only three of us here, four of us. But so back in the day, like back in the 40s when Sartre is writing this, in fact, pretty recently, up until pretty recently, um, you had to have an inkwell on your desk. Your pen did not have ink in it. You had to dip your pen in an inkwell. So it's just a little jar with ink in it. You put it on the corner of your desk. Most desks had like a little coaster, almost like where you put your drink, a drink holder, but it was a inkwell holder. Well, it took me what, about 20 or 30 seconds to explain that. And now, if you didn't already know, now you do know what an inkwell is, what its purpose was, why it exists, how it fulfills its purpose, how it fulfills its function. Well, when Sartre says we want to be an inkwell the way an inkwell is an inkwell, that's what he means. Of course, we don't want to be an inkwell. That sounds really boring. But what he means is we want to be easily defined. An inkwell is just made to be dipped in, right? What is our purpose? What are we made for? It's not that clear. Um, before the inkwell was ever made, excuse me, before the inkwell was ever made, it had a purpose. It was very clear what its function was. And once it was made, once it existed, once the inkwell was manufactured, it didn't have to do anything to fulfill its purpose. It just sat on the desk and was appropriately designed to be filled with ink. That's all. It didn't have to struggle. It didn't have to actively engage with its environment like we do. And that is really hard to face up to. In order to have a purpose, in order to have any meaning in your life, one has to actively engage. But there are ways around this, and bad faith is one of them. We just sort of follow a role. We play a part. We play the role that society wants us to play, that our family wants us to play, that our teachers or whatever want us to play. And it's not really us. It's not really authentic. It's us just trying to skirt our own responsibility. So this is a problem for Sartre, right? So bad faith is almost like self-sabotaging one's own freedom, and it's trying to characterize yourself as an in itself. I'm this thing. I can't help it. I identify as a I don't know, like I'm Irish, and like all I get is like I am Irish, but I don't really care that much about it. But those people that are just like all into their Irish heritage and they got freaking Irish everything, but they never even been to Ireland or whatever. And it's just kind of like, are you just doing this because you got nothing else to sort of latch on to, or like, I mean, it's one thing if your family like kept the traditions going and you guys celebrated and you like got drunk and sing Irish drinking songs, when you were a teenager with your pops. Like that's one thing, but like some people just like I don't know. I feel this way about tattoos sometimes. Like people get tattoos to kind of make up for their lack of originality. Like they don't really have anything to make them stand out. So they're like, oh, I'll get a tattoo. That'll make me cool. That'll make me have a certain image. Sartre says we all do this, and it's all bad faith. It's all, trying to, play a role, play a script, follow a script, and a large part of this, the reason that we do this, is because of our interactions with other people. And this is one more thing I'd like to mention. in preparation for the reading, there's a phenomenon that Sartre spends quite a bit of space on in Being and Nothingness. The phenomenon, he calls it the look of the other. And this is the phenomenon that we often sort of carry with ourselves. It's the feeling of being judged by other people. And he thinks that this is another way in which we self sabotage our freedom, is our concern with how the other is judging us. He gives this sort of I don't know. You would probably say controversial, racy example of the peeping tom. Um, a peeping tom. If you don't know what a peeping tom is, it's a guy, usually a guy. I'm sure maybe there are female peeping toms, but in the movies, it's usually a dude, and he's going around like spying on women. And he's looking for any woman's got their blinds open, and he watches them undress or something like that. So Sartre says, this guy, when he's doing his deed, when he's looking through the keyhole. I mean, Sartre's writing this in the 1940s when they still had those big keyholes you could actually look through them. He's staring through the keyhole to see the woman on the other side. He's not really aware of himself. He's sort of lost in his activities. This is a part of, I think, Sartre's phenomenology that he owes to Heidegger. When we're kind of just going about our day, we're, for the most part, we're not that self-aware. Maybe some people are. If you maybe you're kind of you got anxiety tendencies or something like that. But for the most part, we tend to lose ourselves in our activities. When we're driving down the street, driving to class or driving to work, we're not thinking, I'm driving to work, I'm driving to work, I'm driving to work. No, we got all this other stuff going on in our head. Our driving is just kind of automatic. We might be thinking about the movie we saw last night, or what we're going to have for lunch today, or, like our thoughts are kind of drifting, and we're not saying, I'm driving right now, I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch today, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. We're not really thinking of ourselves as a self separate from the experience that we're immersed in. And this is the same thing for the peeping Tom, says Sartre. He's just sort of lost in his snooping, in his perverted snooping, trying to get a good shot of the lady or whatever. And it's not until he hears footsteps or maybe a rustling in the bushes behind him or something like that. And then immediately he feels the look of the other. And then he reflects, then the I, then the ego, then it's like, I'm doing this. I'm looking through a keyhole. I'm going to look pretty embarrassed if I get caught. What will the other think about me? And this starts a kind of a psychological tug of war where you're trying to, you sort of feel this shame, says Sartre, if you're the peeping Tom, that just immediately shudders throughout your whole being. It's not some, you don't reflect on it that much. It's immediate. When you get caught with your pants down, you're immediately embarrassed. You don't just sit there and go, okay, wait, I got my pants down. They can see. Oh crap! I gotta cut. No, it's just immediate. You've done something wrong. You've been caught. And so for Sartre, this is when you're being judged, or at least you feel like you're being judged by the other, and you can never know what the other is thinking. You can never see yourself the way the other sees you, and this creates a kind of tension. The way that you typically react is either you get really defensive. Sometimes you'll start to make up excuses for yourself. You might say things like, oh, I know what I did was wrong. I shouldn't be a peeping Tom. It's horrible, but I can't help it. I have a condition. I have a sex addiction or some such thing, And Sartre would hate that because he would say, you're denying your freedom. You are responsible. You did it, you pervert. Own your perversion. Is probably what he would say. You're making excuses. You're treating yourself as an in itself, as an object, not as this free for itself that is able to interpret the situation how you see fit. So that's one way that we react when we feel the look of the other. We tend to sort of make excuses, and we objectify ourselves. We make ourselves an object. I can't help it. I have a problem. It's not my fault. Blame society. Blame my genetics. Blame whatever. But then we also might attack the other. So we either objectify ourselves or we objectify the other. We say, you have no business judging me. I am just a concerned neighbor. You don't understand what I'm doing. How dare you think you understand me? You don't understand me. It's like, well, how do you know they don't understand you? Maybe they see right through your ruse, and you're treating them like you understand them. You're saying, oh, I know what you're thinking and you're wrong. Well, how do you know what they're thinking? The fact that you don't know what they're thinking is the reason you're upset about this. And that's the fact that that's why you're defending yourself, is because you know that they're also a freedom. The look of the other, for Sartre, the other is always a capital O other. It's not another object. It's not another thing. It's another freedom, another person staring at you. And they can interpret you just like you can interpret them. And you're not quite sure. Do they trust me? Do they not trust me? Do they think I'm disgusting? Are they willing to overlook this? You don't know. And that tension is kind of unbearable in some cases, especially if you really care about the person. There's, I think, a better example that Sartre gives in one of his novels called the Age of Reason. And I think it's the opening chapter. The main character finds out that his mistress is pregnant, and he leaves her at her apartment because he knows that she's very upset and confused, and they're really not sure what to do. But he assumes that she wants to terminate the pregnancy, which was not an easy thing to do. And I think this novel takes place between World War I and World War II. It wasn't easy to get it was not legal to get an abortion in Paris at the time. So he's very concerned about the situation that he's put her into, and he leaves her at her apartment to go deal with it and figure out, to try to find a doctor or something. But Sartre, as he's writing this story, he's talking about how she's staring at him. She's looking at him, even though we know she's still back at her apartment. But what he's trying to, I think, imply is that look is with him wherever he's going. She doesn't even have to physically be there. He's just thinking about what she's thinking about him. And he's just, geez, she must be so pissed off at me for getting her pregnant. How irresponsible. And I'm an idiot. And, oh, geez, I assumed that she wanted to get rid of it. Maybe she wants to keep it. Maybe we should get married and have, oh, well, how insensitive I'm being. So he's sort of, tearing himself up and, thinking about her. And so this look is something that we carry with us. And so we have a certain image we want to project to the other. And if we can't, then sometimes we objectify them. And Sartre says in both cases, we're making a category mistake. We're either denying their freedom and that we're acting as if we can understand them when we never could. Their consciousness, their own subjectivity it's something we can never have access to. And the fact that we can't is why it concerns us, is why we seek its approval. And we all do to some extent. I'll end on this anecdote, and next class we'll on Tuesday we'll dive right into the reading. But I was on a date once with this young lady who told me that she didn't care what anybody thought about her, and I told her that I didn't believe her. She got really pissed off. She ended up storming out of the date eventually, but I was kind of being a smartass. But I was like, yeah, you do. You care what people. I was like, you might not care what everybody thinks, but you care what some people think. And no, I don't care what anybody thinks about me. I was like, well, why did you get dressed up before you got ready for? Why did you get dressed up for our date? Why did you put makeup on? Why did you dye your hair blonde? Is that just for you? I guess, like, you just stare in the mirror all the time. Like, what? Like, come on, you care what I thought until I guess you figured out you weren't into this or something like that. But maybe, to be accurate, maybe she didn't care about people's approval. she didn't care about their approval, but she wanted me to think that I didn't care. She cared that I didn't believe her, for sure. She got really angry. So she obviously cared to some extent what I was thinking. And I remember being a little rebel as a teenager and having the same kind of attitude. I don't care what society thinks. Screw the man, screw the law. But I didn't want you to think I was conformist. I didn't want you to think I was some preppy. I care what you thought about me. Didn't want you to think I was a goody two shoes. I'm not a goody two shoes. I'm not some sucker. Yeah, I was one of those kids, one of those little rebels. Um, but anyways, this look of the other, I think, is very important in Sartre's phenomenology, and I really think he did himself a disservice by not including this concept of the look. He did not include it in our reading. And so I feel like there's a lot of things he says in the reading, which we're going to get into that next lecture. He says a lot of things that just seem straight up wrong and don't make any sense. Like pretty close to the beginning of the lecture, he says something like, um, the good for me is the good for everybody. And that sounds like, what do you mean? So if I like chocolate, I should expect everybody else likes chocolate? I mean, I think it's kind of weird if you don't like chocolate, but I understand. Like, sure, like I think it's delish, but maybe it's not for everybody. But that's not exactly what he's saying, right? He doesn't expect everybody. When I say something's good, I expect, or I assume that everybody would think that. I'm not sure he's making that quite big of a claim. It actually kind of ties more into the look of the other. And so I'll explain it more next lecture when we get into the actual reading and we get to these claims. But it's a pretty well documented fact. Most professors will tell you this. They should. If they don't, they're doing a disservice to Sartre. But most professors will tell you this when they cover this reading, this existentialism as a humanism. Sartre hated this lecture. Okay, so he gave this lecture as a response to his critics because they thought, look, Sartre, if you're right about if you're right about existence and freedom, then there's really no ethics. Like nothing has any meaning in itself. And so if I engage in a project, that's just up to me, and I can't decide whether it's a good or a bad project. It's just what I decide. I mean, I could decide I want to be a serial killer. I could decide I want to go save the world and feed the children. And you don't have any morality. You have no ethics to condemn or praise me for either decision. And so that's the main argument against him that he's got to somehow respond to. And we'll see how he does this when we get to the reading. But like I said, he hated this. Almost immediately after he gave this lecture, he kind of knew he didn't do that great of a job. And ironically, this is the most widely read of all his works. So the one that he hated the most is the one he's most known for. In a way, there's a bit of a consolation because it is a pretty straightforward reading. If you try to read some of Sartre's other philosophical works, they're pretty difficult. It's hard to read a lot of his. Being in Nothingness is, it's almost just for grad students in philosophy, I would argue, or at least upper level philosophy students. But this essay it's something you could read in an intro class, and you get a good general idea of Sartre's philosophy. But the only problem is, and I think this is why Sartre was aware of its shortcomings, is he doesn't do that great a job. He leaves out a lot of details. He doesn't do that great a job of responding to the critics. As far as laying out his philosophy, I think it's just fine. But the responding to the sort of, this is all horrible, it's immoral, it's a pretty weak response. I think he could have added some details. And so when we get into it, I'm going to help him out a bit just from my own background knowledge of Sartre and try to fill in some of the blanks to give him a little bit of consolation. Even though we're reading his least favorite work, I'll try to help him out and not make it too bad. But I better stop there because it's already 5 after, and I said I'd stop early. So I'm going to leave this open for just a little bit longer. I'm going to stop the recording, so we're in